Established in 1988 and sponsored by School Library Journal, the Margaret A. Edwards Award honors an author as well as a specific body of their work for significant and lasting contribution to young adult literature. It recognizes an author's work in helping adolescents become aware of themselves and addressing questions about their role and importance in relationships, society, and the world. Please join me in welcoming this year's Margaret A. Edwards Award recipient, Neal.
Wow. I'd like to thank ALA Yalsa and School Library Journal for recognizing my work. This is both literally and figuratively the honor of a lifetime. The validation of my career, and to be in the company of so many great authors who have won this award. You know, fiction doesn't get the respect that it deserves. A lot of people dismiss it as frivolous. You know, that, especially young adult literature. You know that my father never read any of my books? Why? I don't read fiction. And yet, he was the one who would go to the bookstores and turn them face out on the shelves and put them on end caps. But he never read any of them. But something that I've come to realize is that fiction is the single most important thing that we have as human beings. And I think I have a very compelling argument, but I'll get to that later. So how did I get started with this thing that somehow, against all logic, became a career? When did I first identify as a writer? Well, when I was 18, I bought the Writer's Market. It lists every publisher, and to every publisher's absolute horror, all of their addresses and phone numbers. I wrote a book when I was 18. It was based on a story that I told as a summer camp counselor. I wrote it because all the kids at camp said that they would read it if I wrote it. And then I systematically went through the Writer's Market, and I picked about 20 different publishers. That's when there were a whole lot of publishers, not like just 4. And at the time, my parents lived in Manhattan, and I was back from spring break from UC Irvine here in California. I hand-delivered the envelopes with my manuscripts to these publishers. I still remember walking into those buildings and handing them to doormen. And I received rejections from every single one. If it was current day, I probably would have ignored those rejections and self-published digitally, print on demand, which would have been a serious, serious mistake, because the book was awful. Not just bad, but painfully, gut-wrenchingly awful. The kind of bad that gives you a fever just reading it. Which is my argument against self-publishing. See, aspiring writers these days are denied the glorious benefit of soul-crushing rejection. All those form rejection letters that begin, "Dear author." 12th generation Xerox copies that have been Xeroxed so many times the letters look like ancient runes. Because as painful as those rejections are, we need them. We need to be reminded that we haven't arrived. And that if you think you have, that's the proof that you haven't. I can tell you right now, I have not arrived. All I've managed to do is trick everyone into thinking I know what the hell I'm doing. It was the rejections, as much as the successes, that forged my identity as a writer. Now, my second book, when I was 20, got me representation. A young, upstart firecracker of an agent named Andrea Brown. This book was better than the first, but still not good enough. She couldn't sell it anywhere, and so we had an amicable parting of the ways. It wasn't until many years later that we reconnected, and she's been a pillar at the core of my career ever since. It was my third book that sold when I was 23, represented by Jack Artenstein, purchased by an encouraging junior editor at Little Brown, Stephanie Owens-Laurie, one of the greatest editors ever, who just retired this month. I followed Steph to S&S, and then to Penguin, and then to Hyperion. before my contracts with her got sold at Hyperion to Little Brown and bringing everything full circle again. I've actually been blessed with incredible editors over the years. Jeannie So, Rosemary Brosnan, Justin Chanda, Andrea Pinkney, Liz Koznar, and the late, great David Gale. I mean, how lucky have I been to be in the loving hands of the best in the business, all of whom I don't just see as editors, but I see as friends, as family. Editors and publishers who supported me, even when I came to them with the weirdest freaking ideas. I remember when I pitched Unwind to David Gale. He said, "I have no idea how you're going to pull this off, but I trust you." And then when I delivered the book, one of his colleagues said, "This author is gifted and in serious need of therapy." Gifted. I was gifted with publishers who believed in me. And I will never, ever take that gift for granted. When Unwind, this weird book that was, but wasn't, but kind of was about abortion, took off and bizarrely found this enduring spot on curriculums around the world, I felt gratitude. And I still do for the people who championed it. The publishers, the librarians, the teachers, and the kids who handed it to their friends, but even more importantly, handed it to their parents. One of my favorite comments from a parent came about Unwind, when a parent came up to me and said, "My son forced me to read this book so we could talk about it." I never knew my kid thought so deeply. So there are tons of stories that I could tell you here today, but I'm sure many of you have already heard them. You know, how my third grade teacher threw me out of the classroom on a daily basis because she was convinced I was special needs, although they didn't have such nice words for it back then. She sent me to the library to get out of the classroom, and so I became the librarian's problem. Ms. Judith Shapiro, my elementary school librarian who turned me into a reader. I went that year from being the slowest reader in my third grade class to winning the reading award by the time I graduated from elementary school. I remember when I got the award, Ms. Shapiro came up to my parents at the end of graduation with this big old smile on her face, and she said, "I've named all my gray hairs Neal Schusterman." I could tell you stories about where the books that were selected to be honored today came from. How the Schwa Was Here was inspired by a kid at a school visit who blended so completely into the background, I never noticed he had his hand up for the entire period. Or how Bruiser was my response to the pain of divorce and against cruel and unfair expressions like broken families. How Everlost was my first serious attempt at world building, and as such was more of a roller coaster than Full Tilt, which was inspired by a particularly hellish day at Six Flags. How Challenger Deep was inspired by my son Brendan's experiences with schizoaffective disorder as a teenager. And how trying to make sense of that in words became not just a healing experience for him and for our family, but turned a dark time in my son's life into a light to illuminate a subject that needs as much light shed on it as possible. I think one of the greatest moments of my life was when Challenger Deep won the National Book Award, and I had no speech prepared. So I winged it, and then I invited Brendan up on the stage to accept the award with me. You know, winning was great, but what made it so special was getting the chance to share it with him. And then afterwards, I went back down, and I'll never forget this. My other son, Jared, was in the audience, and we sat down together, and Jared said, "Dad, you've arrived." But no, I haven't. Because the goalpost keeps moving. The goalpost has to keep moving, because if it doesn't, then you become irrelevant. And irrelevance, I think, is something that I fear more than anything else. Well, that in spiders, but that's irrational. But irrelevance, when you're no longer relevant, that's when you need to put the pen down. And I never want to put that pen down. By the way, Brendan is now living his best life, teaching English in Thailand. And he hasn't had an episode for 14 years. And an unnoticeable kid in the classroom? I have no idea what happened to him. Now, I do want to talk a bit about Scythe, which is, I kind of wrote to disrupt the saturated genre of teen dystopia. I've always seen myself as a bit of a disruptor. My parents would always call me the contrary kid, and when I would say, "No, I'm not contrary," they would say, "See? So instead of leaning into the trend, And writing in another story about the world gone wrong, I wanted to explore the consequences of a world gone right. Our best case scenarios instead of our worst case scenarios. A world where we've defeated disease and AI isn't that scary thing we're all afraid of. I researched the hopes of AI scientists and sociologists and medical researchers, and it all led me to life extension. And the inescapable fact that unless we destroy ourselves first, we are going to become immortal. I mean, it's happening soon. Google's working on it, Jeff Bezos is working on it. Scientists are saying it could be less than 10 years away. So following consequence after consequence, I came to a world where we live forever and the only way to die is to be taken by the Jedi of Death, who are dedicated to thinning the population with love and with compassion and with honor. And then I'm at my first panel to discuss the book. It's at the NCTE, and I'm all ready with my talking points, and the moderator asked a question I wasn't expecting. What was going on in your life when you came up with this story? So I had to do some mental calculations, and I had an epiphany. I came up with Psych toward the end of 2012. My mom had had a stroke the year before that had left her in a locked-in state. One day she was fine, the next she couldn't move, she couldn't speak, she couldn't eat. After the hospital did what little they could, she was like that in my home on hospice for about a year. And then finally the hospice doctor finally came to my father and he said, maybe it's time to think about letting her go. There was no hope of improvement. She wouldn't want to go on like this. I was the one who had to turn over feeding to. And for 3 weeks, we held a vigil. And in her final moments, when the nurse came to tell my father that it was time, I held one hand. My father held the other hand. We stroked her forehead and told her that it was okay to go. And she left us. It was October 3rd, 2012, her 79th birthday. And in spite of the pain of her passing, there was peace. Because I realized that dying in the hands of the people we love is not the worst way to go. And the very next story that I came up with was a story about people whose job it was to end life with love and with compassion. Wow, I never even made that connection. You know, sometimes as writers, we don't know what compels us to tell a story. All we know is that it's screaming to be told. Now I knew why I wrote it. It was my way of working through what happened with my mom. This author in need of serious therapy found that writing can be some of the best therapy that there is. Now I talked about my identity as a writer. I want to talk a bit about identity in general. And I want to be a bit of a disruptor. Because identity is something that I've given a lot of thought to, especially over this past year. See, there are 3 places where our sense of identity comes from. It can be handed to us by those who love us and have raised us, our people, where we come from. Or it can be forced upon us by society, when society says, we don't care who you think you are, this is who you are. Or when we won't accept the identities that we're handed, we create a new one. Identity becomes something we choose by looking at the mosaic of who we are and deciding which aspects of ourselves we are going to use to define us. And identity defines more than just who we are. It defines who we allow ourselves to love and who we choose to hate, who we defend and who we go to war with, who receives our empathy and who is denied the slightest shred of our compassion. It defines everything down to the music that we like. It allows Moms Against Liberty to call themselves Moms for Liberty and believe it. Identity defines us and therefore defines our world. And you know what? It's fiction. It's a narrative. Identity is a construct. We take a few of the many things that make us who we are and we say this is what defines us. The color of our skin, our sexuality, our shared history, our shared trauma, our shared language. Every one of those things is real and important, but the weight we give in defining us, is our choice. And how many times is identity defined in the negative? Not what you are, but what you are not. Not what you embrace, but what you repudiate. And so while identity absolutely helps people find their social and cultural family, it also turns everyone else into other. And yet it's all just a narrative. Isn't it wild that fiction defines our lives? Which is why I believe narrative is the most important thing that we have. And we have to take great care with the stories that we tell others and the stories that we tell ourselves. Now, a lot of my life has been about sitting on fences. Not being indecisive, but deciding that the fence is the only place where you can have perspective and not blinders. I've never felt really comfortable being one thing or another, and that's reached into every aspect of my life. For instance, since the beginning of my career, I've been asked by kids, because adults would be mortified asking, "What race are you?" Or, "What's your mix?" For the longest time, my answer was, "I'm a member of the human race. That's the one that I write about. That's the one that matters the most to me." In recent years, I've been chastised for that. I've been told it's offensive because if you don't acknowledge and clearly delineate race in your writing, then you're problematic. Characters presumed white. Inside, I said to hell with that and made the world entirely mixed. Race ceases to be an issue in the world of unwrite. The tone of one's skin is no more consequential than the color of their eyes, an aspect of who they are, rather than defining who they are. Now, through all of this, I never realized how deeply cultural ambiguity was woven into who I am. I have a story to tell you, a narrative about who I am. Neal Schusterman, born to Charlotte and Milton Schusterman, November 12, 1962, a Brooklyn Jewish family. I was bar mitzvahed, and I still remember some, if not all, of my Torah portion. All my grandparents were from Ukraine. My grandpa Dave on my mother's side had Sephardic blood, and so he got really, really dark in the summer. People would mistake him for being black. Now, my parents always said that I take after him, but I look much more like my father, who had tight, curly hair. In the 70s, he had this big old Jufro. So, I always understood the awkwardness when people tried to parse me out culturally. And there were awkward moments, like when I won Ohio's James Cook Diversity in Teen Literature Award for Challenger Deep, for which in a very carefully worded email, I thanked them for including neurodiversity in their definition. So that's who I am. And you know what? It's bullshit. Every last bit of it. It's a fiction, and I do not mean that metaphorically. On August 20th of 2023, just 10 months ago, I left for one of my writing cruises by myself. A lot of you know this, I go on writing cruises to get writing done. You know, it's deductible, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Sunday, as the ship is pulling out of Miami, I get a text from my son Jared asking me, "Dad, who the hell are these people?" He just received his results from Ancestry.com. It gives you a whole list of the people in their database who you're related to. On his mother's side, there are people he knows, or at least family names that he recognizes. On my side, nobody we've ever heard of before. So, the one who is most closely related, supposedly his uncle, according to Ancestry.com, is this guy in rural Maine with Irish-Scottish roots. We follow a link to his personal blog, and there's a picture of him. He looks like my son, Brendan. We dig deeper into this guy's blog and we find an entry from 2 years earlier in which he talks about something his mom once told him, out of nowhere, shortly before she died. She told him that she had a baby nearly 20 years before he was born, when she was 16, and gave it up for adoption. The year that happened? 1962, the year I was born. Okay, so now I have to buy the expensive cruise Wi-Fi because we're pulling out. I can't ask my parents about this. I mean, they've been gone for more than 10 years. And so I text my cousin Norma, who knows everything about the family, and I say, "Hey, Norma, funny thing. Do you know anything about this?" 3 dots. 3 dots for 20 minutes, and finally she responds, Dearest Neal. And I knew from Dearest Neal where this was going. Yes, you were adopted, but your parents swore the entire family to secrecy for 60 years. And I'm in the middle of the goddamn ocean. Literally cut adrift. And so, yeah, I got no writing done on this cruise. Justin, that's why the book was late. I'm sorry. By the way, that book is called All Better Now. It's coming out in February. It's a future pandemic story. Make a note. So what do I know about myself? Well, after a whole lot of sleuthing on the Carnival Mardi Gras, I learned this. My Irish-Scottish birth mother came from a wild bohemian family of artists in New York. Her mother, my biological grandmother, was an opera singer who played the Mother Abbess in The Sound of Music on Broadway, the one who sings Climb Every Mountain. My biological grandfather played trombone professionally. I have an aunt who was the lead flautist with a symphony orchestra in Naples, Florida. And my biological father was a black jazz musician. So biologically, I'm a quarter Irish, a quarter Scottish, half black, and 0% Jewish. And I still remember my Torah portion. I did consult my rabbi about all this. He said that I'm fully accepted in Reform Judaism, but for conservative or Orthodox, I need an affirmation ceremony. What is that? He said, well, it requires 3 rabbis and a mikvah. You know, it sounds like a joke, right? 3 rabbis walk into a mikvah. So, here's my personal narrative that I was able to piece together from exhaustive research. My birth mother, Diana Curtin, had a boyfriend who was also white, but she met a devilishly handsome, well-built jazz kid, black jazz kid at a party, and yada, 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 they were really tired the next morning. That's a Seinfeld reference, and damn it, I still get to do Seinfeld references. And if you have a problem with that, no soup for you. So, she knew that the baby was not her boyfriend's, and never wanted him to find out. The only person who knew about this was her mother, the Mother Abbess, and she figured out a way to climb this particular mountain. They would put the baby up for private adoption to a Jewish family. They even learned some Hebrew and Yiddish to convince the lawyers that they were Jewish and that the father was Jewish. Why a Jewish family? Well, my friend Teresa was adopted in the early 60s, and she knew the answer to that right away. In New York, there were a lot of Jewish couples that wanted to adopt at that time, and a lot of those were private adoptions. And private adoptions basically meant financial arrangements. So basically, I was probably bought. And there are so many levels to that statement that I'm not getting into. But the thing is, my birth mother had a stipulation. The baby would be given to the adoptive parents at birth, and no one on my birth mother's side of the family, not even her, would ever see that baby, because they knew that the baby would be black. They just didn't know how black, and she didn't want her boyfriend to find out that it wasn't his. And that's how I came into this world, and landed on the fence. Although I have a friend who told me, you're not on the fence, you're a bridge. I like that narrative. I'm sticking to that one. And also, my friend Keith said, the universe demanded your presence by any means necessary. That's part of my narrative now too, because I'm pretty damn happy I'm here. My old narrative said I was an only child, but between both sides of my biological family, I have 6 half-siblings, all of whom I am in touch with now. I recently petitioned my pre-adoption birth certificate. You can do that now. You want to know the name that my birth mother gave me? I was named after the boyfriend, who was not my father. I was born Dennis Lee Smith Jr. Yeah, not part of my narrative. This whole story is a rabbit hole, but I've got to talk to you about my Aunt Millie. My father never read any of my books, but my Aunt Millie, she read every single book that I ever wrote until she died at the ripe old age of 93. And she would write me these long letters. I kept every single one of them on these legal paper. And one of them recently came back to me, so I went looking for it, and I found it, and this is what she wrote. This was in 1999, her letter after reading The Dark Side of Nowhere, which is about a kid who finds out that he's an alien. And somewhere on page 4 of her letter she writes, "The ending was powerful and really shows what it would be like for someone to find out that they were adopted." Oh, Aunt Millie. Dear sweet Aunt Millie, you missed the point. No, she had the point all along. And you know what I found out? Aunt Millie once worked as a legal secretary. She's the one who arranged my adoption through her boss. I wish I could have had this conversation with her. I wish I could have had this conversation with my parents. Oh, and remember that newly discovered half-brother, the one who lives out in rural Maine? He's a published science fiction author. And now we have a deal to write a book together for Simon & Schuster. This wormhole is endless and it's wonderful. My kids love this. Brendan couldn't wait to tell his friends about it. Jared, always the practical one, said, "Does this mean we're BIPOC writers now?" And my daughters, Joelle and Erin, they said, "Well, our friends always said you were a black guy." But it does pose a question, doesn't it? Am I a person of color now? If I say no, that's offensive because I'm denying my biology. But if I say yes, that's offensive because it somehow feels opportunistic. You know, fence or bridge or this. See, one thing about learning about all this is that I feel a little more daring when it comes to discussing certain subjects. And I'd like to comment on the whole idea of staying in your lane as a writer. Because my lanes go like every which way now. I believe that every writer, has the absolute right to write whatever the fuck they want. Because that's what creative expression is. But if you're going to take on someone else's perspective, then you had better do your homework and you had better do it right. Because the way I see it, there are 3 kinds of diversity, and all 3 are critical. 1, we need books where kids from every underrepresented, underserved group see themselves. 2, we need to publish voices from underrepresented groups and make sure they get to tell their stories. And 3, writers need to have the unencumbered freedom to put themselves in other people's shoes, because that's what writing is. Putting yourself in perspectives other than your own so that we can all understand each other better. We need to remember that third part of diversity. Otherwise, literature suffers, and if literature suffers, we suffer. In the current environment, we would never have had masterpieces like Laurie Halse Anderson's Chains, or Tobin Anderson's The Astonishing Life of Octavian Nothing. They're not related. Not all white people named Anderson are related. But it goes all ways. There's a celebrated black writer friend of mine who told me that she is exhausted of not being allowed to write stories that aren't about being black. She just wants to tell great stories without constraints. And how many times have we heard, "It's not your story to tell"? I get it. But in my heart, I do not accept that. We are all human beings. Every story is our story to tell if we tell it right. And if we are additive to the human experience. So I challenge the publishing industry to stand up to the restrictive, prescriptive voices out there. Stop enforcing the lanes of limitation and just let us write. I mean, if Jason Reynolds wants to write about Scandinavian waffle dog, and I don't know why he'd want to, but if he does, he should have every right to do it. So now my life has come full circle in every way. My first award was given to me by a librarian, and now I'm receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award by America's librarians. My perceived history has come full circle to my actual history. Now I have a whole new perspective on the life that I've lived, and as well as my life and my career moving forward. Everything passes through this new lens now. And yet, does any of it alter who I am as a human being? No. It changes the box that I check on a census. And it gives me a whole new facet of myself to explore. It's not a devastating thing. It's surreal, and it's exciting, and it's fun. I've chosen a narrative in which this is additive to my life. It's like finding there's a secret room in a house that you've lived all your life, and it's filled with wonderful things you never knew were there. It's like I've walked out of the Truman Show in the middle of the ocean, exactly like he did, and stepped into tomorrow's unknown. So has the work of fiction that is my life, has it changed? Absolutely not. But now there's a sequel. Thank you very much.